In late October 2019, Glenn Coleman turned off County Road D67 and rolled his 1998 Ford F-150 into southern Grundy County, with the heater stuck on low and the odometer reading 312,400 miles. Rust had chewed through both rocker panels. The tailgate cable on the left side was replaced with baling wire. He wore patched brown overalls, a seed company cap faded almost white, and insulated gloves with 2 fingers restitched in black thread. At 71, he looked exactly like what younger operators joked about at coffee counters. The county relic, who still changed his own bearings and argued that painted sheet metal did not harvest grain. Parked beside him that morning were 2 polished diesel pickups worth more than his farmhouse interior, one of them belonging to Trent Halverson, restructuring officer for Prairie State Agricultural Bank, with dealership shine still on the sidewalls. By appearance alone, Glenn looked one bad season from collapse. By arithmetic, he was one of the most liquid private landholders in 3 counties. He controlled 1,140 paid-off acres across Marshall, Grundy, and western Blackhawk County, held $2,180,000 in treasury bills on a ladder, timed to spring input cycles and fall grain settlement gaps, and lived on a monthly household budget of $1,940, utilities $286, groceries $420, fuel for the pickup $168, insurance $244, church giving $300. The old 1963 linoleum in his kitchen had 2 repaired seams and never bothered him. He had spent 46 years building a zero-debt fortress that looked, from the road, like thrift and stubbornness. Glenn knew exactly how a man in patched overalls could walk into a foreclosure clock and reverse it with numbers. Glenn did not begin wealthy, and he did not inherit a rescue. In 1973, he rented 160 acres on a crop share and kept a pocket notebook with 2 columns, must pay and can wait. Must pay always came first, and it was short: seed, fuel, repairs. Property tax on the small parcel he bought later. Can wait included nearly everything else that modern agriculture tells people to chase early. New paint, new cabs, new debt dressed up as growth. He watched older men survive dry years because they could miss a payment to themselves but not to a bank, and he never forgot the order of that sentence. The key influence came in 1981 when a neighbor, Earl Pennington, lost 520 acres after rates jumped and variable notes repriced faster than corn could recover. Glenn was 33 and stood at the edge of the auction lot, not bidding, just listening to lot numbers and balances called out like weather reports. Earl was a good operator. Nobody in that county disputed that. He had expanded in a strong market, financed equipment at terms that looked manageable, then caught timing risk in both interest and commodity price. Gone, foreclosed, auctioned off. Glenn drove home in silence and wrote one line in that notebook: "Debt is weather you cannot control." His acquisition history looked plain at the time, and extraordinary in retrospect because he kept using cash and patience when others used speed. 1978. Bought 80 acres for $52,000 cash after 3 years of retained earnings and a private note from a retiring couple paid in 18 months. 1983. Bought 40 acres adjoining that first parcel for $31,600, half paid at signing, half paid from hog receipts by year end. 1987. Bought 20 acres from Marion Keller's husband on a handshake for $19,000, then formalized the deed with no lender attached. 1994. Bought 120 acres at $1,140 per acre after an estate sale, few attended because ground quality was uneven. He tiled the wet corners himself over 6 seasons. He repeated that pattern through periods when lenders were eager and terms were loose. 2001, 150 acres at $1,875 per acre, cash from grain reserve and matured treasury ladder. 2009, 260 acres at $2,150 per acre during panic selling, the largest check he had written to that date, funded with a mix of treasury redemptions and 7 years of retained operating surplus. 2013, 170 acres at $4,080 per acre, from a family wanting immediate settlement, closed in 21 days because he did not need approval committees. 2017, final 300-acre block added through 2 transactions totaling $1,794,000, both paid without leverage. By the time younger producers began calling him old-fashioned, he had converted old-fashioned into durable optionality. He was not anti-technology, and he was not nostalgic for discomfort. He was anti-fragility. That distinction mattered. If a machine improved net return after total cost, he considered it. If it improved pride only, he walked away. His records showed what that meant in practice. Between 2010 and 2019, average annual machinery expense, including depreciation equivalent, parts, and hired labor, was $96 per acre on his core operation. Comparable financed operations in the same region routinely carried $182 to $236 per acre once principal and interest were included. Yield differences existed, but not enough to erase that spread in mediocre price years. Glenn cared less about winning the best year contest and more about never entering the forced sale contest. By the final week of October 2019, people still described him with the same 2 words: careful and behind. They were right about careful. His daily discipline looked smaller than it was. He bought filters by case in winter discount programs. He rebuilt hydraulic cylinders in his own shop for $84 in seals and 2 hours of labor instead of replacing assemblies at $640 each. He tracked fuel burn per field and adjusted pass patterns to cut idle time that looked trivial per day and material per season. When a dealer quoted $146,000 down and $6,980 per month on a lease package, Glenn ran the 5-year outflow at $564,800 before variable maintenance and insurance riders. Then he compared that against his own machine strategy. One older unit purchased at auction, $18,640 in parts, and contracted specialty labor, plus $6,200 annual maintenance reserve. Same acreage window, different risk profile. His house matched the method. No remodeling loan. No granted apology for success. Water heater replaced at failure with a basic unit, paid at pickup. Roof done in metal in 2012 with cash from one high-priced soybean year, specifically because it eliminated recurring shingle cycles. His annual personal expense in 2019 was $23,280, leaving operating and investment cash to compound. He was not denying himself. He simply did not spend where compounding could do better work. The social divide sharpened as equipment size grew around him. At sales meetings, younger operators would trade monthly payment figures the way prior generations traded rainfall totals. They were not foolish people. Most were diligent and hardworking, and many fed families and payrolls under pressure that outsiders never understand. But the prevailing paradigm favored leverage as identity. Glenn sat through those conversations, nodded, and asked one question when invited. What is your break-even if corn is 3.71 and your rate resets 2 points higher? Often, nobody had run that exact line. On Tuesday at 9:12 in the morning, Marion Keller opened a certified letter at her kitchen table and learned she had 72 hours before Prairie State Agricultural Bank filed final possession on 640 acres. Her husband's variable rate operating note had reset from 4.1% to 9.8%. Annual debt service jumped from $118,000 to $246,000. Trent Halverson arrived with a cross-collateral package, tying her house, bins, and future crop insurance to the restructure and a liquidation schedule that began with her 1982 John Deere 7720 Combine, which he called non-economic to retain. Glenn was already seated at the table because Marion's husband had once dealt with him fairly when nobody else would. Glenn asked for every loan statement, every lien, and the exact payoff to daily accrued interest. Trent looked at the overalls, then at the rusted pickup outside, and dismissed him as a sentimental neighbor with a junk truck. 2 witnesses heard it. Glenn said nothing, pulled a legal pad from his coat, and started writing numbers in a tight vertical column. The first number he wrote was $2,071,400. Then he underlined it twice and asked Trent for the accrual factor per day. Trent did not answer immediately. He adjusted the cuffs of a pressed blue shirt, glanced toward the window where his black 2000 23-quarter-ton pickup sat with dealer detail shine, then back at Glenn's gloves with the stitched fingers and grease-darkened seams. The contrast in that kitchen was almost theatrical. One man wore polished boots that had never stepped through bean stubble after rain. The other had mud packed into the sole lugs and a coat zipper repaired with baler twine. Trent finally slid a packet across the table with a practiced tap of his pen. $466.70 per day until filing, he said, voice flat with institutional confidence. But this is procedural now. We are beyond neighbor advice. Marion sat still, both hands around an untouched coffee mug, while the 2 witnesses from the bank's legal office kept their eyes on the paperwork and not on her face. Glenn read line by line, lips moving slightly at each subtotal, and asked a second question that sounded small, but changed the room. Is this note blended variable with annual reset trigger tied to prime spread plus internal risk premium? Trent gave a short smile that carried the familiar judgment. You understand enough to be dangerous, he replied. Not enough to be useful. Glenn turned one page and pointed to the fee schedule. If you file Friday at 4, total is $1,486,233 with penalties and legal. He looked up at Marion, not at Trent. That is the number that matters. It was the first moment that morning when she exhaled all the way. Before this day became public county gossip, Glenn had spent nearly 5 decades training himself for exactly this sort of arithmetic under pressure. He had not learned it in classrooms. He learned it in machine sheds, auction lanes, and one humiliating spring in 1976 when he signed a short-term operating note for $18,000 at 8.75% because he believed one strong corn year would absorb the cost. That year delivered flood damage on a weak basis. By December, he owed $19,640 after interest and fees, and the lender offered a rollover at 10.2%, with mandatory crop lien language he had not noticed in the first contract. Glenn paid it off anyway, but only by selling 12 bred heifers he planned to keep. He never forgot the feeling of being cornered by calendar and compounding in the same week. No shouting, no dramatic collapse, just a legal document narrowing his options one line at a time. That was his formative wound, and it produced a philosophy he repeated only when asked. Debt can help speed, but it can also remove choice, and choice is the asset that keeps farms alive in bad years. By 1979, he had formalized his own decision framework on yellow ledger sheets kept in a metal box above his workbench. Column 1 listed fixed obligations. Column 2 listed variable costs at conservative yield assumptions. Column 3 listed worst-case carry. Any purchase that pushed fixed obligations above 38% of three-year average gross margin was rejected, even if the dealer offered incentives. He did not call it risk modeling. He called it sleeping at night. His early numbers were modest and exact. In 1980, gross farm revenue was $92,400 on mixed acres and small livestock. Total operating expense was $54,880. Net before taxes and household draw was $37,520. He paid himself $12,000 and rolled $25,520 into reserve. In 1981, revenue fell to $81,300. Net dropped to $22,940. He still added $14,000 to reserve because household expense remained capped at $11,400. In 1982, the year many neighbors refinanced shortfalls into longer notes, Glenn took no term debt and instead delayed a shed expansion, patched an existing roof for $620, and kept liquidity intact. That decision looked conservative then. It looked brilliant later. There was another influence besides hard math. Earl Pennington, before his foreclosure, once told Glenn while they greased a planter hinge, "You can survive embarrassment. You cannot survive forced timing." Earl had expanded with good intentions and modern assumptions, and the 1981 rate shock tore through those assumptions without mercy. After Earl lost 520 acres, Glenn attended the auction and bought nothing. Then he visited Earl 2 weeks later with groceries and a fuel card prepaid at $300 because practical dignity mattered more than lectures. Earl took the bag and said, "Do not finance pride." That sentence stayed. In 1984, Glenn bought his first major piece of equipment through patience rather than borrowing pressure. A 1971 John Deere 4020 with 7,800 hours for $8,400 at a winter sale in Tama County. Comparable dealer inventory that spring listed similar horsepower units around 13,900 to 15,200. Often sold with financing at 11.4%. He paid cash from reserve, then put $1,260 into injectors, hoses, and rear tires over 9 months. Total all in, $9,660. He ran that tractor for 16 seasons. Average annualized capital cost, roughly $604 before fuel and maintenance. The math did not make him flashy. It made him resilient. He repeated the same approach in unglamorous increments. 1986, Gravity Wagon pair for $1,100 total, repainted and rewired for $240. 1989, Grain Drill purchased for $350 and rebuilt for $410, while a new finance drill package quoted at $12,800 plus interest. 1992, used pickup bought at county sale for $2,900. Driven 6 years. Sold for $1,200. Net transportation cost under $300 per year, excluding fuel. 1997. Bin fan motors replaced with high-efficiency units at 1,480 total, cutting seasonal power use by an estimated 11%. Small numbers, repeated without drama, became structural advantage. Across those years, Glenn also developed one rule that younger operators often dismissed until they faced volatility. Machinery must serve acres already controlled, not acres hoped for. If he farmed 640 acres, he built equipment capacity for 640 plus weather buffer, not for a speculative jump to 1,200. Expansion came through land purchases only when he could close without debt and still preserve a minimum 12 months of operating cash. That kept his growth slower than peers during boom years and far safer when cycles turned. By the second week of November 1998, he had enough patterns in his records to calculate what debt avoidance had already bought him. Compared with a neighboring benchmark operation of similar scale that carried average annual term and operating interest expense of $74 per acre, Glenn's interest line was effectively zero except occasional short float paid within 30 days. On 700 worked acres, that gap was $51,800 per year. Over 10 years, even before compounding, $518,000 stayed on his side of the ledger. He used part of that retained cash for land and part for treasury ladders, creating the liquidity now sitting quietly behind his patched overalls. Back at Marion's table, his pencil kept moving. He listed her debt layers in sequence and did not soften any of it. 2014 refinance, $1,300,000 at 3.9% variable exposure. 2017 equipment addition, $420,000, blended terms with reset clauses. 2018 drainage financing, $280,000. 2019 emergency carry, balances consolidated under tightening covenants. Total principal, so $2,071,400. Reset to 9.8% at double pressure at the worst possible commodity moment. Corn at 3.71 per bushel did not forgive optimism financed at floating rates. Marion asked him one question in a voice worn thin from sleepless nights. Did we do anything reckless? Glenn set the pencil down and answered with the restraint that defined him. You did what many good operators did. Timing turned against you. He nodded toward Trent's packet. Now we decide whether to lock in loss or rebuild structure. Trent tried to reclaim momentum. He pointed to the line item for the 1982 John Deere 7720 and called it obsolete collateral with liquidation value, likely below $10,000 in current condition. Glenn asked for the latest maintenance log. Marion brought a stained binder from a drawer. Separator bars replaced 2 seasons earlier. Feeder chain updated. Engine compression test from spring within acceptable range. Known issue, clean grain elevator lag under wet load. Glenn ran quick estimates on the legal pad. Rebuild and preventive overhaul at $18,640 could return harvest capacity in time to salvage high-risk acres. Dealer lease alternative already proposed by Prairie State Network required $146,000 down and $6,980 per month. 5-year outflow was catastrophic under her cash position. The witnesses watched Glenn convert that comparison into plain language. One path needs cash you do not have and creates fixed payments you cannot carry. The other path needs targeted repair and labor you can schedule. He circled $18,640, then wrote projected avoided field loss from delayed custom harvest. $84,300 at current soybean value assumptions if weather window closed. Trent dismissed it as speculative. Glenn did not argue tone. He argued inputs, moisture, and timing. 3 days earlier, Marion had been preparing to sign whatever the bank placed in front of her because urgency had collapsed her sense of options. Now she had numbers on paper and an order of operations. First, verify exact payoff through filing hour. Second, preserve yield by restoring the 7720 immediately. Third, stop cross-collateralization that would risk house and bins. Fourth, rebase annual budget on fixed obligations, not hope. Glenn's handwriting was neat enough that she could follow every line. He stood, folded the legal pad once, and looked at Trent with the same calm expression he used when setting planter depth. "You have your process," he said. "So do we." Then he asked Marion for every statement from 2014 forward: crop insurance declarations, grain contracts, tax returns, and parts invoices on the combine. She rose and began collecting folders from a kitchen cabinet shelf, while outside the rusted Ford waited in the gravel with 312,400 miles on the odometer, and just enough room in the passenger seat for a cardboard box full of numbers that might still save her farm. Glenn set the cardboard box on Marion's counter, squared the folders by year, and started building two stacks: legal exposure and operating reality. The legal stack contained notes, liens, and addendums that converted short-term pressure into long-term vulnerability. The operating stack held yield maps, input invoices, insurance declarations, and machine logs that still represented a living farm. He did not raise his voice. He did not give a speech. He wrote dates and balances on fresh pages, then asked Marion to read each number back, so both of them would hear the same truth. "Read this line," he said, tapping a covenant page. She swallowed and read it anyway. "Cross default, tied to any missed payment above 30 days. He nodded once. "That is how they take the bins after they take the land." By Wednesday morning, 38 hours remained before filing, and Glenn had turned Marion's history into a ledger sequence that showed not failure of character, but accumulation of fragile obligations. He drew a line down the page and gave her his own sequence beside it so she could compare structure against speed. 1978. 80 acres, $52,000 cash. No term debt, reserve left $9,400. 1983. 40 acres, $31,600 total, paid by year-end livestock receipts, reserve rebuilt in 14 months. 1994, 120 acres at $1,140 per acre, total $136,800, tiled over 6 seasons from operating surplus. 2001, 150 acres at $1,875 per acre, total $281,250, funded from grain reserve plus matured treasury bills. 2009, 260 acres at $2,150 per acre, total $559,000, largest single outlay, closed cash during panic selling. 2013, 170 acres at $4,080 per acre, total $693,600, retained 12-month operating cash after purchase. 2017, 300 acres in 2 tracts, total $1,794,000, paid cash without equipment refinancing. Then he wrote the second sequence, the one most people never saw because it happened in bank windows and treasury confirmations rather than dealership lots and coffee shop talk. 2010 Treasury ladder opening balance, including pre-2010 retained principal transfers, $820,000, 2011 additions from retained earnings, $86,000, weighted yield 1.4%. 2012 additions, $94,000, weighted yield 1.1%, maturities aligned to seed and fertilizer timing. 2013 additions, $121,000 after land closing, weighted yield 0.9%. 2014 additions, $173,000 on high soybean margin year, weighted yield 1.2%. 2015 editions, 148,000, weighted yield 1.6%. 2016 editions, 132,000, weighted yield 1.9%. 2017 net additions after land purchase, 61,000, weighted yield 2.1%. 2018 additions, 204,000, weighted yield 2.6%. 2019 additions through September, 151,000, weighted yield 2.9%. October 2019 ladder total, $2,180,000. Marion stared at that last number, then at the patched sleeve on his coat. Nobody knew, she said. They did not need to, Glenn replied. The arithmetic was not glamorous, and that was the point. On his own operation, average annual gross revenue from 2014 through 2018 ran $1,126,000 across owned and rented ground. Average operating expense, excluding family living, ran $712,000. Average pre-tax operating margin, $414,000. He reinvested selectively, set household spending at $23,280 per year, and moved the rest through a strict order: taxes, maintenance reserve, cash buffer, treasury ladder, then opportunistic land. No monthly machinery note, no variable rate term loan, no dependence on a lender renewing confidence at exactly the right hour. Marion's sequence looked different because the structure was different. In 2014, her household refinanced $1,300,000 at 3.9% variable, with confidence that grain strength would hold. In 2017, they layered $420,000 for equipment because dealer incentives reduced first-year cash outflow. In 2018, they added $280,000 for drainage under another variable structure, rational at signing, dangerous in combination. In 2019, they rolled carry debt into a package that seemed temporary. Then rates reset and corn dropped from 5.42 to 3.71 per bushel. The same weather, the same markets, the same county roads, two balance sheets, two different futures. Glenn set his pen on the pad, let the silence hold for a beat, and then turned to the revenue page that would decide whether any rescue plan could stand. Glenn returned to the folders and ran break-even on Marion's 640 acres, under conservative assumptions. Corn acres, 380 at 100C 73 bushels per acre, and 3.71 cash price, gave gross $243,895.40 before basis adjustments. Soybean acres, 260 at 51 bushels, and 8.96 gave gross $118,810. Combined gross estimate, $362,705.40. He penciled crop insurance expected value, then subtracted realistic operating costs by category. Seed, $74,200. Fertility and chemical, $129,400. Fuel and drying, $31,600. Labor and repairs, $42,900. Insurance and property tax allocations, $56,300. Total direct and allocated operating cost, $334,400. Projected margin, $28,305.40 before debt service. That number alone explained why a reset to $246,000 annual debt service was terminal under the current structure. By Wednesday evening, he had one legal pad filled front and back and a second pad started for alternatives. Option 1, the bank path, required cross-collateralization and liquidation optics with dealer oversight, then left Marion with reduced assets and still little buffer. Option 2 required immediate liquidity injection to stop filing. targeted repair of the 7720, and a hard governance plan she could follow acre by acre. He drafted the governance lines in thick pencil so she could not miss them later. No new variable debt, fixed sinking fund $420 per acre per year, minimum 12-month cash reserve before any expansion. Across Marshall and Grundy, the contrast with peers had already become visible, and Glenn treated every one of those families with respect because he had watched them work in heat, mud, and long winters just like everyone else. Caleb Rourke had expanded from 1,100 to 2,900 acres between 2012 and 2018, carrying a debt package that peaked at $7,200,000 with multiple reset dates. His yields were strong in good years. His management was not careless, but when rates moved and two average crops arrived back to back, annual debt service climbed above $610,000, and land values softened enough that refinancing came with harsher terms. He lost 480 acres in a forced sale and spent the next season custom hauling grain to keep cash flow alive. Denise and Howard Lenz ran a disciplined family operation with 3 hired hands and a reputation for clean fields. Their breaking point was not extravagance, it was timing stacked in the wrong order. They locked fertilizer contracts near peak pricing, then financed inventory carry and machinery payments through a line that repriced from 4.6 to 8.9%. On paper, a 1-year squeeze. In practice, 2 poor basis years and escalating interest consumed working capital. Their Chapter 12. Filing listed 3,480,000 liabilities against 2,740,000 assets. They cried in private, sold machinery at auction, and took jobs in a repair shop they later purchased on contract. Mateo Ruiz had built a cattle and feed rotation that survived volatility for more than a decade. His renewal notice in 2019 reset his operating line to 9.25% with tighter collateral language. Feed costs had already climbed and finish prices were soft. He sold the herd to satisfy the line and preserve the home place, then leased out pasture while rebuilding plans on a smaller base. Good man, hard worker. One structural mismatch between debt terms and market timing changed his trajectory. Those were not morality tales. They were arithmetic under pressure. By Thursday at 6:40 in the morning, cold rain moved across Black Hawk County, and the soybean window narrowed again. That weather line mattered, because every day of delay increased field loss, moisture penalties, and cash stress. Glenn and Marion pulled the side panels on the 7720 in his machine shed and worked from the binder. Feeder house chain tension corrected. Clean grain elevator lag traced to worn paddles and one bent lower boot section. Parts list 6,980 from 2 suppliers. Labor commitment from a retired mechanic Glenn trusted, 62 hours at 70 per hour, total 4,340. Additional preventive work and contingency, 7,320. Total rebuild budget remained 18,640. The dealer route still sat on Trent's schedule. 146,000 down, 6,980 per month, and insurance riders that would have pushed annual machinery cash outflow above 102,000 before fuel. Glenn wrote both totals on the same page and circled them for Marion. One buys time, he said. One sells your next 5 years. Crisis in that county did not arrive as one dramatic event. It arrived as a layered squeeze. Commodity prices weakened. Input costs stayed elevated. Rate resets punished variable exposure. Weather narrowed harvest windows and increased custom wait times. Credit committees shortened patience. Families that had always paid eventually missed one date, then faced legal language built for exactly that moment. By midday Thursday, Trent had scheduled the auction notice draft and prepared courthouse filing packets. Confident process would outpace resistance. Glenn's advantage was not luck. It was retained choice. He walked from the combine to the office phone in the corner of his shed, called his treasury broker, and gave a concise order: liquidate $320,000 from the nearest maturities and wire settlement to his operating account by Friday morning. The broker confirmed pricing and same-day execution window. Glenn wrote down the confirmation number, then called his local bank and moved $410,000 from his grain reserve account into immediately available funds. Both transactions were logged before noon. External contacts resolved. Liquidity path opened. At 2:15 that afternoon, Marion signed a limited power document Glenn's attorney had prepared, allowing payoff tender and filing intervention without granting control over her deed beyond the stated purpose. Physical evidence was copied, notarized, and placed in 2 envelopes, one for courthouse presentation and one for her records. Glenn handed her the duplicate and waited until she placed it in a metal file box herself. As rain tapped the shed roof and the rebuilt parts sat in labeled trays, Glenn looked once at the 7720 with its faded green panels and thousands of hours behind it. In county gossip, it was a scrap. In his ledger, it was a bridge asset with a measurable return in exactly the week that mattered. If they could bring it back into field condition before the next dry window, they could preserve crop value and narrow the gap between survival and surrender. If they reached the courthouse with cleared funds before Trent recorded final possession, they could stop the seizure line by line, stamp by stamp, number by number. By 4:50 on Thursday afternoon, the last replacement paddle was bolted into the clean grain elevator. The chain slack was reset to spec, and the retired mechanic wiped his hands on a red shop towel and gave Glenn a single nod. The 7720 coughed once, then settled into a steady diesel pull that was cleaner than it had sounded in years. Marion stood near the shed door with both arms folded tight against her coat, listening to that engine the way people listen to test results. Glenn did not celebrate. He checked unloading auger response, separator engagement, and header lift pressure, then wrote 3 numbers on the pad clipped to the fender: fuel burn, moisture, loss estimate. They ran a short pass in the nearest soybean field before dusk. Monitor and drop pan checks came back under 1.9% loss. In that weather window, with custom crews still booked out, that meant salvageable value instead of deterioration. By first light Friday, they cut hard through 12 hours of narrow conditions and brought in enough beans to secure $84,300 of crop value that would likely have degraded in the next rain cycle. That figure went straight into Glenn's legal pad under 1 line. Bridge asset proved. At 1:18 in the afternoon, Glenn parked the same rusted Ford at the Black Hawk County Courthouse Annex, stepped out in patched overalls, and carried 2 envelopes and a cashier check. Trent arrived 5 minutes later with the foreclosure packet, auction authority forms, and a dealer representative ready to proceed to the yard once recording cleared. The hallway had that flat, fluorescent quiet of institutional rooms where life-changing decisions are treated as routine clerical flow. The clerk took Trent's packet first, date-stamped the top sheet, then reached for Glenn's envelope. Glenn spoke in the same even tone he used in machine sheds. Tendering full payoff on Keller notes and associated penalties through today's accrual total $1,486,233. He set the cashier check down with the payoff statement attached, including per-day interest calculation through filing hour. The clerk read the amount twice, then looked over Glenn's shoulder toward the hallway, as if expecting a different person to claim the document. Trent leaned in, jaw tight. "Funds verification required." "Of course," the clerk said. Verification took 11 minutes. Prairie State confirmed receipt channel and instrument validity. Then the clerk pulled the recorded foreclosure packet back across the counter, stamped it withdrawn, and entered cancellation into the docket, while both bank witnesses watched the screen update. Trent's authority to proceed with liquidation dissolved line by line in real time. No shouting, no courtroom drama, just paperwork reversing paperwork. The wealth reveal landed there, in that administrative quiet, with the precision Glenn preferred. For years he had been treated as a man one fuel bill away from the trouble. On that Friday, county staff, bank officers, and bidders at the yard learned the same fact within an hour. The man in restitched gloves had just moved $1,486,233 in cleared funds without financing contingency, after already liquidating $320,000 from Treasury maturities and transferring $410,000 from reserve in less than a day. When the auction clerk later asked for proof of capacity for any residual lot disputes, Glenn provided a balance letter showing $2,180,000 in laddered treasuries as of late October, adjusted downward only by the executed intervention. Appearance ended. Arithmetic remained. Before we go any further, if you want to track whether discipline like this can survive 5 more volatile years, subscribe and stay with the full ledger, because the next phase is where most rescue stories fail. At the auction yard in Blackhawk County, the loudspeaker was already live when Trent received final notice from the legal. He read the cancellation statement once, voice thinner than usual, and several bidders turned toward Glenn's truck as if the rust on the doors no longer matched the man who stepped out of it. Lot 1. The 1982 John Deere 7720 had technically opened before full cancellation. Notice reached the ring. Glenn bid $12,000, won it, signed the transfer, then filed a same-day bill of sale to Marion for $1 with a recorded use covenant. No leverage, no lien attachment, no collateralization against that machine for 10 years. The combine everyone called scrap became protected working capital. Marion stared at the papers in her hand, then at Glenn. He gave her 8 words and nothing more. Debt does not get a second vote. Generosity, in Glenn's framework, was never sentimental and never loose. It had structure, thresholds, and consequences. At Marion's table that evening, he set terms for recovery that were strict because they were meant to last. He would carry $900,000 as a zero-interest recovery note tied to grain settlement transfers. No monthly panic payments, no compounding penalty. Annual remittance windows after harvest with mandatory minimums in years above benchmark margin. In exchange, Marion accepted governance terms in the writing. No variable rate operating debt, equipment sinking fund at $420 per acre annually, and 12 months of operating cash before any discretionary capital purchase over $25,000. Their attorney filed the agreement, and both parties signed with the witnesses. 3 days later, Glenn extended that same philosophy beyond one farm because the county's stress pattern was too widespread to ignore. He did not announce a foundation yet. He started with direct bridge contracts. Caleb Rourke received the first structured offer, $180,000 at zero interest for 36 months, collateral limited to crop proceeds on 160 leased acres, with one non-negotiable condition that Caleb publish annual cash flow statements to a 3-member local review board. No secrecy, no pride financing. Caleb accepted. He used $74,000 to clear high-rate carry, $52,000 for essential input prepay at discount, $31,000 for equipment repair backlog, and held $23,000 as weather buffer. By the end of the next season, he was current on every obligation and had rebuilt a $68,400 cash reserve. Denise and Howard Lenz were next. Glenn offered $140,000 to purchase the repair shop contract they were renting to own, then resold it to them on a 10-year note at 1.5% fixed, monthly payment $1,257. Their prior blended debt burden had been $4,980 per month with unstable terms. The restructured payment freed $3,723 monthly for inventory and payroll stability. Within 18 months, they added 2 service bays, hired 1 apprentice mechanic, and posted positive net operating income of $112,600 on annual shop revenue of $486,000. Mateo Ruiz took a different package because cattle cycles required different pacing. Glenn funded $210,000 in 2 tranches, $130,000 for herd reentry and $80,000 for feed and fencing rehabilitation, both fixed at 0 interest for the first 24 months, then 2.0% thereafter if unpaid. Mateo insisted on paying earlier than required once calf prices normalized. He repaid $96,000 in year 2 and converted the balance to fixed-rate local credit only after his debt service coverage exceeded Glenn's threshold of 1.45 for 2 consecutive reporting periods. By then, he had rebuilt to a 120-cow operation without variable rate exposure. By March 2020, Glenn formalized the pattern as the Coleman Field Stability Fund and seeded it with $3,400,000 from Treasury redemptions, retained farm surplus, and 1 land rent distribution he could have kept personally. Cap per loan was $250,000. 0 interest for initial term. Mandatory mentorship requirement. Each recipient had to mentor 1 younger operator and submit annual statements of cash flow, debt ratio, and reserve months. Aid was not charity theater. It was disciplined transfer of optionality. If you are learning something from this arithmetic-first approach, share it with someone who confuses revenue with resilience. The deeper examination came from ledgers, not testimonials. Glenn and Marion both kept complete records, and those records made the case better than any speech could. Marion's 5-year recovery sequence ran like this: 2020 gross crop and insurance receipts, $1,084,200. Operating expense, $742,900. Pre-transfer margin, $341,300. Recovery transfer to Glenn, $150,000. Year-end retained earnings, $131,300 after tax and reserves. 2021 receipts, $1,212,500. Operating expense, $801,600. Margin, $410,900. Transfer, $180,000. Retained earnings after obligations, $168,400. 2022 receipts, $1,100,000 mass $76,800. Operating expense, $789,200. Margin, $387,600. Transfer, $170,000. Retained earnings, $162,700. 2023 receipts, $1,298,400. Operating expense, $836,300. Margin, $462,100. Transfer, $200,000. Retained earnings, $207,500. 2024 receipts, 1,254,600. Operating expense, 819,700. Margin, 434,900. Final scheduled transfer to reach cumulative 900,000, 200,000. Retained earnings, 192,100. By spring 2025, her deed was clear on the full 640 acres. The recovery note was satisfied exactly as contracted, and retained earnings stood at 612,000 with no variable debt. The 7720, now at 6,940 engine hours, moved to backup status after planned replacement, with a used fixed-cost unit bought under the sinking fund rule. The machine that was tagged non-economic had preserved the bridge year and enforced a philosophy through steel and timing. Glenn's own book showed the intervention did not weaken him because he never overextended the help relative to liquidity. Post-intervention liquid assets after payoff and bridge commitments bottomed at 1,021,000, then recovered through farm margins, note repayments, and ladder yields. His annual household budget remained essentially unchanged, rising from $23,280 in 2019 to $26,040 in 2025, mostly from utilities and insurance. He still drove the 1998 Ford. He still fixed his own belts and bearings. Public assumptions adjusted slowly, then all at once. The fund's first 12 loans totaled $2,460,000 by committed principal. 9 remained zero interest through full term. 3 converted to low fixed rates after extension triggers. Default count, 0. Average recipient debt service ratio at entry, 61% of gross margin. Average after 3 years, 27%. Collective acreage stabilized by recipients, 3,420 acres with assessed market value near $16,100,000. That multiplier effect was Glenn's thesis in numeric form. One disciplined balance sheet prevented one foreclosure, then prevented a chain. Trent Halverson's resolution also moved through arithmetic rather than drama. Prairie State reassigned him after the Keller withdrawal and later accepted his resignation. 2 years after leaving, he reappeared as an independent consultant advising smaller operators on lower leverage ceilings and used equipment first procurement. He never gave a public apology, but his published planning templates now capped variable exposure and required stress tests at lower commodity prices and higher rates than lenders marketed in good years. Even that was a kind of correction. By the second week of October 2025, County Memory had refiled Glenn Coleman from relic to reference point, though he ignored both labels. At dusk, Marion cut her own field in a steady pass. The backup, 7720, parked along the edge like a retired witness, while Glenn's old Ford idled near the gate with rust on both rocker panels and enough fuel for the drive home. He waited until Marion finished the row and swung the header clear, then stepped from the pickup and held up one hand for her to kill the engine. The evening was cold enough that both of them could see breath when she climbed down. Glenn handed her a folded printout from the fund ledger, not a speech. She read the first line under the yard light. Coleman Field Stability Fund, Annual Compliance Review. All 12 borrowers submitted statements. All 12 mentorship assignments active. Marion looked up. All 12? All 12, Glenn said. No missing reports. That was the true test year, not the courthouse year. By the first week of November 2025, every recipient had completed at least one full reporting cycle under the same 3 ratios Glenn required from the beginning: debt service as a share of gross margin, reserve months on hand, and fixed versus variable exposure. The numbers were not dramatic, but they were clean. Entry debt service burden across the 12 operations had averaged 61% of gross margin. At review, weighted average was 27%. Entry reserve coverage had averaged 1.8 months. At review, it was 8.6 months. Variable rate exposure, which had once dominated most operating lines, fell below 12% of total obligations across the group. Caleb Rourke's trajectory became the one younger farmers studied because it showed recovery without mythology. He had lost 480 acres, moved into a lease structure, and rebuilt from there with that 180,000 bridge note and hard reporting discipline. In 2020, he had no consistent reserve habit. In 2021, he finished with 68,400 cash buffer. In 2022, he crossed 104,000. In 2023, after one dry spell and one mediocre basis year, he still held 96,300 because he did not raid reserves for discretionary equipment. By 2025, he operated 160 leased acres and 80 owned acres. He repurchased from a retiring neighbor for $512,000 at fixed 4.2% over 15 years, with $180,000 down from retained earnings. Annual payment was $31,900. Projected debt service ratio on conservative pricing stayed under Glenn's ceiling. Caleb now mentored a 24-year-old tenant operator on input discipline and cash flow planning, and he did it without pretending the first collapse had been someone else's fault. Denise and Howard Lentz treated their repair shop like a field in drought. No waste, no panic, no vanity purchases. Their restructured note at 1.5% fixed kept monthly payment at $1,257, and they swept excess cash first to parts inventory turns, then to a 6-month payroll reserve. By 2024, annual shop revenue reached $531,000, with net operating income $126,400. In 2025, they prepaid $22,000 principal and still funded health coverage for 5 employees. Howard taught evening diagnostics classes through the county vocational program one night each week. Denise ran the books with the same precision she once gave to field records, and she mentored 2 farm spouses on debt covenant reading so nobody signed cross-default language they did not fully understand again. Mateo Ruiz rebuilt slower than outside observers expected and faster than lenders predicted. His $210,000 package had been paced by biological realities, not banking calendars, and he refused expansion until forage reliability and feed cost bands were stable for 2 consecutive years. By late 2025, he held 120 cows, all financed through fixed structures only, with debt service coverage above 1.50 and a reserve account at $142,700. He converted one old confinement shed into low-cost winter shelter using salvaged steel and $18,900 in materials, avoiding a financed build that had been quoted near $240,000. He now mentored a beginning livestock couple on cull discipline, pasture rotation, and the unglamorous math of replacement timing. The other 9 fund recipients were less known publicly and equally important in aggregate. 3 grain operators used bridge capital to clear high-rate carry debt and stabilize input buying windows. 2 specialty crop families used zero interest terms to avoid predatory short-term financing while transitioning contracts. 4 small mixed operations restructured machinery and land rent commitments without surrendering core acres. Combined principal deployed stood at $2,460,000, and cumulative repayments by October 2025 totaled $1,318,400, all recycled into new bridge capacity rather than extracted. Collective acreage stabilized remained 3,420 acres, assessed near 16,100,000. That multiplier did not come from one dramatic check. It came from governance attached to every dollar. By January 2026, the Fund Board published its second annual accountability sheet at the Marshall County Extension Hall, one stapled packet per chair, no glossy branding. Glenn sat in the back row in the same patched overalls and did not speak unless asked. Marion presented her line items in 6 minutes and handed the microphone to Caleb. Denise answered 3 questions about inventory turned discipline. Mateo gave one sentence that stayed with the room. I borrowed time, not lifestyle. Nobody applauded loudly. They wrote notes. Trent Halverson attended that meeting unannounced and stood near the side wall with a legal pad tucked under his arm. He no longer worked for Prairie State. After leaving the bank, he built a consulting practice around risk review for family operations and small regional lenders that had grown uneasy with aggressive leverage models. Early on, many assumed his change was cosmetic, but his templates told the real story. He now required stress tests at corn prices below optimistic forecasts, forced rate scenarios at least 2 points above current offers, and written machinery comparisons that placed used repair pathways beside financed new packages before any recommendation was signed. When the Q&A opened, Trent asked for the floor and kept his remarks short. He said many institutions, including his former employer, had treated liquidity as secondary during expansion years. He said he had been wrong about how quickly variable exposure could erase good operations. He did not ask Glenn for public absolution, and Glenn did not offer theater. After the meeting, Trent walked over, held out his hand, and said, "Your math held." Glenn shook once and replied, "Math does not care who likes it." Their conflict did not become friendship, but it did become useful. By 2027, Trent's client reports consistently recommended lower leverage ceilings and used equipment-first procurement where field capacity allowed, and several operators avoided covenant breaches because those standards were applied before stress arrived. Prairie State Agricultural Bank also shifted, slowly and then structurally. The legal witnesses who had sat at Marion's table remained with the institution, and both later pushed for clearer covenant summaries in plain language before signature. The bank introduced a policy requiring a 1-page risk digest attached to all variable rate renewals, including payment projections at higher rates. It was not altruism. It was late learning. By the spring planning window of 2027, the roll call on everyone named in this story could be read without footnotes. Glenn Coleman remained in Marshall County, still driving the 1998 Ford F-150, odometer past 336,000, rocker panels rough, engine maintained, no loan attached. Marion Keller operated her 640 acres, free and clear with retained earnings, above 700,000 after another disciplined cycle, and she had not violated the no variable debt rule once. Caleb Rourke was current on every obligation and had become the mentor he once needed. Denise and Howard Lenz owned their repair business under stable terms, employed local technicians, and had rebuilt dignity through invoices paid on time. Mateo Ruiz held a right-sized herd, fixed rate only, with reserves that could absorb a poor season without liquidation. Earl Pennington, the neighbor whose loss had shaped Glenn decades earlier, had passed away in 1996, but his sentence still traveled county roads through people who never met him. Do not finance pride. Glenn kept a small card with those words inside the metal ledger box above his workbench. He had never turned that into a slogan. He treated it as operating instruction. The physical evidence that once sat in envelopes was now boring, which is how durable systems should look. The courthouse withdrawal remained recorded and uncontested. The $1 bill of sale for the 7720 and its 10-year anti-leverage covenant remained active in county records. Fund notes were filed, monitored, and either repaid or performing. Annual statements were submitted on schedule. Nothing was left implied. The equipment roll call mattered too. The 7720, at 6,940 hours when moved to backup duty, still started and ran each season for pre-harvest checks and occasional small-acre windows. Glenn's older tractors, rebuilt rather than replaced on fashion cycles, remained serviceable because maintenance had always been funded before convenience. Marion's primary harvesting unit was now a used, fixed-cost machine purchased through sinking fund cash, not debt optimism. At the lens shop, 2 bays stayed booked most weeks with repairs that extended machine life for operators who had stopped confusing age with a weakness. On a clear evening in late September 2027, Marion cut the west quarter at dusk while Glenn watched from the gate and tracked nothing except header height and weather. The field finished clean. Grain moved. Bills stayed predictable. That was the legacy, not applause. If you want more stories where arithmetic beats appearances, subscribe now and stay through the full records, because quiet discipline rarely looks dramatic until the year it saves someone. Comment with one number you now track differently in your own operation, whether that is reserve months, debt service ratio, or repair versus replace cost. Share this with the person who looks ordinary, drives an old truck, and may be carrying more wisdom than anyone at the table. Marion brought the combine to the end rows and shut it down. Glenn turned toward the Ford, the rusted door catching the last light, and drove home on county roads he had traveled for decades, still debt-free, still understated, still proving that the poorest-looking farmer in the lot could be the one holding everyone else together. The gravel popped under Glenn's tires as he turned into his own yard, killed the engine, and sat for a full minute with both hands on the wheel while the heater kept breathing low, stubborn warmth into the cab. Then he carried the worn cardboard records box into the house, set it on the 1963 linoleum, and began closing the loop the same way he had opened it, line by line, document by document. The original payoff receipt for $1,486,233 went into a fireproof drawer. The courthouse withdrawal copy went into a labeled binder. The $1 bill of sale on the 7720 and the 10-year anti-leverage covenant were scanned, printed twice, and placed in separate folders, one in his safe and one marked for Marion's file cabinet. He clipped the Treasury broker confirmation to the wire transfer record from his bank so the money trail could be audited by anyone, anytime. Nothing stayed loose. Nothing stayed verbal. 2 mornings later, Marion drove to his place before sunrise with a thermos and her own stack of papers. They sat at Glenn's kitchen table, under the same yellow light that had seen every major decision for 40 years, and she read each archived item aloud while he checked it off. The notary packet from the limited power document was complete. The attorney invoice had been paid in full. The legal pad pages from the foreclosure week, with the columns marked legal exposure and operating reality, were hole-punched and inserted into a black ledger book that Glenn titled Keller Recovery Structure. When she finished, she looked at him and said what she had not said in public. At my table that morning, when Trent looked at your coat and smiled, I thought you were going to walk away. Glenn shook his head once. I was looking at accrual, not him. By the third week of November 2027, the first cold snap had set in, and the extension hall in Marshall County filled with borrowers, spouses, and 3 young operators who had come because someone told them real numbers would be on the wall. Caleb stood first with his annual sheet projected behind him. Gross receipts, 2027, $412,600. Operating costs, $297,900. Debt service, $34,200. Debt service ratio, 29% of gross margin, down from his entry year above 60%. Reserve months, 9.4. He pointed to one line and did not dramatize it. I wanted a newer planter in March. Cash flow said wait. I waited. Marion nodded from the second row because she knew exactly what that restraint cost in pride and saved in money. Denise and Howard followed with shop ledgers that were cleaner than most farm books. Annual revenue had reached $558,300, with a net operating income of $133,900 after wages, insurance, and parts carry. Their fixed note payment remained $1,257 per month, unchanged and predictable. Denise told the room that the old panic had not vanished, but it no longer ran their decisions. We rid every covenant. We price every repair against replacement. We keep 6 months' payroll in cash before we touch expansion. Howard added one practical detail that made younger operators write faster. They had reduced customer breakdown downtime by offering preseason inspections at $210, and that service line alone had produced $47,000 in revenue, while reducing emergency credit use for their clients. Mateo spoke last and brought photographs instead of slides. Fence lines rebuilt with salvaged pipe. Winter water system replaced for $12,400 cash instead of a financed package quoted at $38,000. Herd at 124 cows with feed reserve measured in days and debt measured in fixed terms only. His 2027 coverage ratio held at 1.53, even with a weaker sale month. Then he gave the room the sentence that explained why Glenn's model had multiplied. The fund did not save me by removing pressure. It saved me by making pressure measurable. Behind him on a printed board were the aggregate outcomes across all 12 loans. $2,460,000 committed, $2,100,000 to $4,700 repaid by that date, 0 defaults, 3,420 acres stabilized, and a combined assessed value that had climbed to $17,300,000 as land prices recovered. One intervention had become a framework others could run. In February 2028, Trent Halverson stood at the side of the same extension hall during a lender panel session and waited until the formal remarks ended before asking for the floor. He was no longer the pressed shirt authority with foreclosure packets under his arm. He carried a plain binder and a legal pad, and he spoke in a tone that suggested he had rehearsed the words to remove excuses from them. He said his old restructuring models had assumed borrowers could absorb variable rate shocks faster than operating reality allowed. He said liquidation first sequencing often destroyed recoverable farms by forcing bad timing. Then he turned toward Marion, then toward Glenn, and delivered the part people had expected him to avoid. I misjudged both the risk and the man. I saw old equipment and old clothes and assumed old math. I was wrong. No applause followed. This county did not run on public absolution. It ran on whether behavior changed when no one watched. Trent's templates did change. By planning season that year, he had reviewed 23 operations for 2 regional lenders and rejected 7 financing packages that depended on optimistic commodity assumptions. He pushed used equipment alternatives in 14 cases and documented repair versus replace comparisons with full 5-year outflow tables. One family later told Marion his insistence on fixed terms kept them from signing a variable note that would have repriced above 10%. Trent never became a hero in local memory, but he stopped being a hazard, and that mattered. By late September 2028, Glenn and Marion met at the Black Hawk Courthouse Records Office to verify the status of every document from the foreclosure week before annual planning began. The deputy clerk printed the chain: foreclosure, withdrawal still uncontested, covenant on the 7720 still active through term, recovery note satisfied and released. No liens filed against Marion's core acres. Marion folded the certified copies into a manila envelope and tapped it against her palm the way Glenn once had. "This envelope used to scare me," she said. "Now it proves I own my choices." The remaining loose thread was human, not legal. One of the 2 bank legal witnesses from the original kitchen table meeting, Laura Finch, asked to see Marion after church in October. She admitted she had recognized the cross-default trap in 2019 and had said nothing because it was not her role to advise clients. She said that silence had followed her for years. Marion listened, then handed her a printed checklist. The fund now gave every borrower before signatures: rate, stress test, collateral map, cross-default trigger, reserve months, and exit cost. "Use this where you work now," Marion told her. Laura did. By 2029, she was compliance lead at a smaller credit union and had made plain language covenant summaries mandatory. In the first week of October 2029, 10 years after the certified letter, Glenn's odometer rolled past 300 much 48,000 on the same Ford, heater still weak, rust still visible, tailgate cable still bailing wire. He had enough cash to replace it 3 times over, and no interest in making a point with new paint. Marion called him at 6:10 in the evening, asked if he wanted to ride out to the West Quarter, and he said yes. The retired 7720 sat near the tree line, cleaned, serviced, and started once each month in season, not because she needed it daily now, but because she remembered what it had done when time was tight and options were narrower than fear. They stood by the gate while her primary machine worked through soybeans in steady passes, lights sweeping across rows that belonged to her without qualifiers. Glenn watched header height and residue spread, then checked his watch the way he always did near dusk. Marion handed him one final sheet from the latest fund audit. 15 active mentorship pairs now, including 3 operators under 30. Total capital recycled through repayments and relending, $4,980,000. Defaults, 0. She smiled, small and tired and satisfied. "People still say you look like you are 1 bad year from done." Glenn settled his cap and looked out at the field. "That is fine," he said. "Looking poor costs nothing." The poorest-looking farmer in the lot had never been poor in the way that mattered. He had been liquid when others were leveraged, calm when others were cornered, and generous only after the math worked. He had not won by predicting weather or outshouting markets. He had won by refusing to surrender choice. At full dark, Marion turned on the end rows and finished the final pass, while the old backup combine waited quiet at the edge, and Glenn's rusted pickup idled in the lane, ordinary as ever, carrying home the man who had made arithmetic a form of mercy.